All right, good to see you all this morning. We're continuing in this series, Reading Your Bible, Interpreting Narrative Analogies. This is part 5 of this series, so we're looking at narrative analogies specifically. So we've gone over cross-references, the importance of narrative analogies. We went over narrative analogy versus typology. And last class we did identifying narrative analogies. So today we'll be interpreting. So we looked at qualifying factors that connect stories and persons together in the Bible by similar vocabulary or things that happen, and that intentionally form a link between stories and passages of Holy Writ. And I went over briefly the importance of slowing down our Bible reading, and again, eating your Chinese food with chopsticks can promote slower eating, more focused eating, and we become more aware to uncover narrative analogies when we're paying attention like that. By the way, I came across something I think maybe a link to a narrative analogy in my reading this morning. I'll share with you here in a minute. So by slowing down our reading and expecting connections in the scripture throughout. These connections are most likely intentional, the way they are inspired, the way they are worded, that seem to purposefully and intentionally connect with other passages as kind of a clue. And again, they are meant to be found. These are from the mind of God, and this is the way the Bible was inspired. Today we'll be considering the topic of interpreting narrative analogies, and this is where things can get tricky. We can find some interesting connections in the Bible, and sometimes they end up becoming meaningful, and sometimes they don't. For instance, this morning I was reading through in my reading plan for this year, I'm in Ezekiel 8, and I came across an interesting passage that reminded me of something else. I'll see if you guys kind of be like, oh yeah. In Ezekiel 8, I think verse 3, it says, "And he put forth the form of an hand, and took me by the lock of mine head. And the Spirit lifted me between the earth and the heaven, and brought me in visions of God to Jerusalem." That sound familiar at all to you guys? To me, it made an instant connection to a certain person that's described in something similar. Anybody? Or am I just the only weirdo? Daniel? Something to do with, it actually doesn't mention the other person's hair, but it's implied. A certain person went riding on a mule and was caught in the branches by his head, and it says that he was caught between heaven and earth. Absalom, David's son Absalom. And so when I read this, I immediately thought, it said a lock of mine head, and instead of being caught in a branch, the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and the heaven. And that phrase, between the heaven and the earth, almost identical, is similar in 2 Samuel, I forget which chapter, about Absalom, but I'll have to look into that.
Yes, that would be a negative contrasting.
Yeah, exactly.
Bad guy versus good guy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You know, with any connections that we find like that, be it similar to the Bible's poetic parallelism, by similar phrases, stories, or characters, we can have a poetic effect by the connections. So two characters, similar things are happening, similar phrases are being used, seems like a definite connection. But wait, one person does the opposite of the other. In the Bible, we may not think about it, but we often find meaning in opposites. And parallelism in the Bible's poetry sections does that quite a bit. The use of antithetical comparisons. So think of the connection we made with Noah's Ark and the flood, and then Lot's house in Sodom. the fire came instead of water. And think of Jesus and Jonah in the boat, asleep during the storm. I brought this up several times. They both end up calming the sea in different ways. And if you think about it, it's kind of humorous. One had to be tossed in. The other commands the wind and the waves to be still. Consider Joseph and Potiphar's wife, and now David and Uriah's wife. Consider the roles in each analogy. Who seduces who? Who refuses who? We find meaning in synonymous and antithetical comparisons. Phineas and the Torah, Phineas and Samuel, both priests, very different. It can end up being very meaningful by the similar or opposite comparisons that we find in scriptures, these connections. So with parallelism, the Bible's poetry typically is synonymous, antithetical, or synthetical. I actually did several classes on this before, but I wanted to briefly go over some of this. Where the first line of poetry says whatever it says, the second line either says something similar, opposite, or it completes or intensifies that first line. And it comes off as like a complete sentence in that way. And that's synthetic parallelism. So they say. Biblical poetry rhymes ideas more than it does sounds. It takes a little more focus to understand what biblical poetry is doing, but once we're used to it and we train our mind to look at it that way, it is how the Bible is expecting us to read these things, these poetry sections. So with synonymous, an example, Deuteronomy 32:16, they provoked me to jealousy with strange gods. First line. With abominations provoked they him to anger. Second line. Saying a similar thing twice. Antithetical. This is from Proverbs 12:12. The wicked desireth the net of evil men, but the root of the righteous yieldeth fruit. So it compares two different kinds of people. Synthetical. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. Then you can compare those two together as well. That's Psalm 19:17. It completes the thought in its second line, or intensifies it. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. So we also found that sometimes various psalms compare and contrast not just in their verses, but the themes that are brought up. And I pointed out several psalms that I myself found, and I'm sure there are more. Sometime I need to go through the psalms and navigate it and write my findings down. But I mentioned how Psalm 19's two themes of God revealed as creator, starts out, the heavens declare the glory of God, can be compared in a similar or synonymous way by comparing its latter half. God revealed not through creation, but through his law. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. And so in the psalm itself, it has two themes rather than just each line being comparative or opposite. Psalm 23 does this with the two themes, the good shepherd and the generous host, you could say. Psalm 95, how great it is to worship the Lord. Oh, come, let us sing unto the Lord. And then it compares it to its second half. Harden not your heart with being disobedient, and instead of drawing near to God, going into exile. Kind of like, you choose. So I bring this up because the Bible's poetry, especially the Psalms, do some pretty amazing things besides its surface message. However, we see that the themes rhyme too, don't they? The themes can rhyme. They are similar or opposite in that sense. So by comparison, I've been bringing up the idea of that the Bible's narrative, its stories and such, are presented in a rather poetic fashion by use of narrative analogies. And even the stories have poetic structure to them through these analogous connections. And Postell, Seth Postell of the book that I'm going through here, The Art of Narrative Analogy, goes on to explain the similarities of narrative analogies to poetic parallelism. After I wrote all these notes about it. I'm like, oh, well, good, we're on the same track. Which we'll get into some of his next chapter here in a minute. Okay, so I want you to consider something, how much of the Bible has to do with parallelism of some sort. We went through cross-references, or parallel passages, as they are called. We went through synonymous, antithetical, and synthetic parallelism, meaning the Bible's poetry, which we came to the stats that 33 or 4% of the Bible is poetry. I think that actually may be more than that, but that's the consensus for now. We have word or sound play, which also usually takes two words that mean similar or opposite things. Tzedek and Semek in Isaiah, righteous and wretchedness, So we have chiastic structures, which is, in my opinion, parallelism on a different plane. It goes A, A, B, B, C, C, D, D, E, F, until it gets to that central turning point. And so in that way, that's a form of parallelism. Chiastic structures. And then we get to narrative analogies. Now the Bible's narrative is doing this thing where it's it's comparing two stories or characters, or like I said, a phrase in the beginning in Genesis, in the beginning in John. It's intentionally linked like that. So, in that sense, I don't have a stat for you, but it's quite a bit. It's quite a bit that the Bible uses some form of parallelism, whether it's in the poetry or narrative analogies in its stories. So I'm going to say it. I think that it's rather poignant to understand the dynamics of the literary art that we find in the Bible that's showcased in Scripture in this fashion. All these different sorts of parallels. And so much of the Bible assumes that you know how this is working, whether it's in the prose or the verse, the poetry of the stories. And so much of the Bible's messages are highlighted and designed through the various usages of parallel literary art. So Postell, in his book, quotes commentator Berlin, and I forget where his first name was used, but at some point he just keeps quoting him as Berlin. He says that parallelism is the correspondence of one thing with another, which is, I like that. It's a really simple way to say it's paralleling two things together, one with another. You just got to decide, is the second time similar or opposite? Postell points out several instances of one is like the other. In a similar way, synonymous parallelism, only comparing stories and people through narrative analogy. So let's consider a few. And by the way, in his book, he does use lots of Star Wars analogies as an example, the movie of this, and then he goes into that. He's seen them. Yeah, so he brings up Star Wars quite a bit, but I'm not really going to get into his usages of the Star Wars movies. Okay, so A is like B. In this case, Noah is like Adam. There are several instances of unique shared vocabulary between the two, Adam and Noah. And what he mentions isn't even what I would have mentioned the first time if you asked me to do a narrative analogy between the two. So I would have thought of a different example, but here's what he brought up. Genesis 9, 1 through 3, and I'm reading out of the King James Bible. He says, "And God blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moveth upon the earth, and upon all the fishes of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat or food for you, even as the green herb have I given you all things." And then he compares that, going back to Genesis 1, verses 28 through 30, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth." This is using similar vocabulary. "And subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of the tree yielding seed, to it shall be for meat, for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for food. And it was so. So Postell makes it out that, and it's probably easier to see it if I had a slide of those passages together. He does have some of these throughout his book. That he makes it out that Noah is being cast as the new Adam. B is like A is like B. And so in this case, Noah is like Adam. Not necessarily that Noah replaced Adam, but he's being cast as the new one by the way the Bible phrases certain things. He's riffing off of Adam, being featured in a way that connects him back to Adam. So, another one. Jesus is like Moses. Again, there are several narrative analogies that one could make for this case. And again, what I would have thought of isn't what Postell brings up. But he brings up in Matthew 2:19 through 21, says, but when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeareth in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, arise and take the young child and his mother, and go into the land of Israel, for they are dead which sought the young child's life. And he arose and took the young child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. And then we compare that with Exodus 4:19 through 20a. It says, and the Lord said unto Moses in Midian, go, return into Egypt, for all the men are dead which sought thy life. And Moses took his wife and his sons and set them upon an ass, and he returned to the land of Egypt. So one, they go to the land of Israel, one, the land of Egypt. So there's some similar things and some things that are different, or you could say Israel and Egypt in a way are very opposite. So just as in Matthew, they are seeking to kill the child, and in Exodus, they're seeking to kill Moses. And so we see a similar thing. So this is one of several passages that presents the person of Jesus as the like Moses. So remember that a narrative analogy doesn't necessarily replace one character with another, but presents one character like another. And this is one of the gripes that we had with typology versus a narrative analogy, where the Bible's more or less saying that this person is like this person, not that they necessarily replace them, even though, the one probably died and the other one came about and is taking the role. It's that in a way they are replacing them in that sense. I'm going to read a little bit from the book here. What goes around comes around. In the case of Jacob's stealing of the blessing from Esau, Genesis 27, it would be easy to conclude the end justifies the means, were it not for the reflection story about Leah's supplanting of Rachel on her wedding night. And once again, the unique vocabulary and plot sequences shared by these stories strongly suggest the father and the older daughter's plot to supplant the younger daughter by taking advantage of Jacob's night blindness, in an inversion of the mother and younger son's plot to supplant the older brother by taking advantage of Isaac's literal blindness. And the inversion of the storyline along with its characters, however, highlights not the contrast, but rather a parody, similarity of their inappropriate behavior. B equals A, and hence Jacob's well-deserved punishment. The end apparently does not justify the means. Okay. Then Postell briefly points out, goes over points to determine meaning in the art of narrative analogy. And so I wanted to go over some of those points with you guys this morning. Those are just a few examples that we have that we just went over. So 1, find the narrative analogy. Easy, right? Based on shared themes, vocabulary, unique shared plot points in the stories, etc. Number 2 is to pay attention to the location of the narrative analogy. And Postell states that especially if an introduction to a book of the Bible contains narrative analogies, like right in the first page or two, like Genesis and Samuel, for instance, the rest of the book may very well carry on in them as well. But he's saying that's kind of the biggest clue, is once we start seeing things that connected with the first chapters of a book, that like we see the looking at the fruit, eating it, something bad happens right in the first few pages of the Bible, and then we start seeing that thing happen over and over with the sons of God coming down and seeing the women and taking them, and something bad happens, and vice versa. It keeps on happening over and over, all the way to, Abraham's wife. They see her, they think she's beautiful, a plague is going to come, and all this kind of stuff. So it starts repeating all throughout the book, and that's one clue that he's saying when a book starts doing that, it very well is probably going to do it throughout. And he mentions that 1 Samuel starts out with a narrative analogy to Joseph, and that we can expect several more throughout the stories of 1 and 2 Samuel. Okay, number 3 is look for explicit comments about narrative analogies in the book, what book of the Bible you're reading. While narrative analogy is typically an implicit comparison, sometimes the narrator or the characters in the text refer explicitly to the key figures and events of their analogies. Luke explicitly mentions Elijah and Elisha in Luke 1:17 and 4:25-27, both of whom are crucial figures in Luke's depiction of Jesus and the apostles in Luke through Acts. In the introduction of the book of Joshua, God explicitly tells Joshua he will be with him, just as I have been with Moses. Okay, like this is where the text explicitly tells you he'll be with someone like he was with someone else, and it's making that connection already. This is not an off-the-cuff statement, rather this is the author's way of explicitly alerting the readers to an extensive use of narrative analogies between Joshua and Moses. So like as we read Joshua, we're going to see many comparisons, even to the point of a sea splitting, etc., that we're going to see similar things happening to them. So from the beginning of the end to the book. Number 4 is map out the similarities and the differences. And with that, he says, as we read a biblical narrative with a mindful awareness of the importance of narrative analogy, we suddenly notice a unique word or word cluster that seems conspicuously out of place, or quite similar to another story that we have already read. Now, I just demonstrated this with you with the passage I read this morning in Ezekiel 8, and with Absalom, with the lock of the hair with Ezekiel and being caught up in heaven and earth, similar to how Absalom was mentioned. He says, we either instantly recall that other story, or we perform a lexical root or word cluster search of an unusual words and phrases that have caught our attention. And Postell advises to cut and paste the suspicious language or words or stories that you see, and to kind of put them side by side. You can use lexical or different word study helps and such, online resources that you can connect and look up words for and all that, or a lexicon, Strong's Concordance, etc. And so for me though, I usually end up doing this in my head. I may do this with my find with the Ezekiel and Absalom thing this morning, but I think of the words and how, that reminds me of this story. And sometimes we can do it in our minds because we're familiar with it. We can compare it like that. And that's, like I said, usually how I do it, based off my recollection or what I'm comparing. And so, anyway, he has several pages on how to use other types of online or lexiconical work to make those, to kind of map it out and show the comparisons or contrasts that the analogy may have. So, Postell says, because the interaction between the similar and the different creates shifts in the meaning and new meanings, the subtle differences in narrative analogies are often highly charged with meaning. We will do well to take Maynet's advice, another commentator, says the hermeneutic rule may be enunciated as follows. When two things seem identical, look for the difference. Okay, he says at this stage of the investigation, Learning to ask the right questions is a critical skill. Are any characters or actions in this analogy inverted? Kind of like I mentioned with the Phineas and the Torah and the Phineas and Samuel, both priest sons. One does something very righteous, the other one's doing stuff that's not righteous. Do any differences significantly alter the outcome of the plot? Are any critical actions left undone in one story over against the other? Ultimately, we are trying to discern between inconsequential and consequential differences in the stories. By inconsequential, we are referring to the differences that have absolutely no bearing on the meaning of the comparison of the target story with the source story. And sounds kind of confusing, but basically just trying to map it out, considering the stories and what's going on, what's different, etc. He says, as Joshua Berman reminds us, the process of discovering similarities and differences is not two different steps, but a simultaneous act of discovery as we continue to read both stories side by side. The more we read, the more similarities and differences we will discover, and the more key similarities and differences will stand out. So with the example going back to Noah and the flood and Lot and the fires of Sodom and Gomorrah, we see, remember I mentioned the word play, Habite and Teba. It's the same spelling, but different rearranged letters, which is a form of wordplay that is more rare in the Hebrew Bible, but it is used. And by saying the ark and the house, Habite, it's using, there's a connection there. And with judgment coming, a door is shut, water comes and floods the earth, fire comes and floods the earth? Nope, some towns. So it's like we can notice a bunch of differences between these analogies that are, it's like, okay, that's not unintentional. Like that's, like you said, you just keep finding things. And so that's just one example. I know I briefly mentioned it already, but any questions on that?
Not a question, but a comment, like all this, this whole idea of the narrative, what's it called, narrative?
Analogy.
We've all heard the expression, history repeats itself.
Mm-hmm. That's a key way to look at it.
But the Bible shows that history does repeat itself.
Oh, yeah.
And if we think of history as his story, that is God's story, his story does repeat itself.
Right.
It's like, because you see the same, it's just different people at a different place and a different time, but it's the same story, the same basic lesson.
And those can happen all the way into our lives as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's why it's relevant, because, that's a good point, because, you can say, well, so what? Okay, so this story is a repetition of that story. Well, how's that relevant? It's relevant because there's a lesson for us to learn.
Right.
Follow the good example and avoid the people that were bad examples.
And I'm glad that you said that, because one of the things is, it's not like, oh, the Bible's just this cool hip book. Wow, this is cool, all this stuff we're digging up and looking at. No, but rather, I think of it as the fingerprints of God. That it's repeating over and over and happening to similar things. That God, in similar ways, is setting certain people, training certain people up, and they make the right choice or the wrong choice. And we see those examples here, and it causes us to think, which one would I do? Which one did I do? Oh, whoops, I did the wrong thing, we see like with Sarah and Abraham, when Abraham tries to lend his wife as being his sister so that he doesn't get killed from Pharaoh, and we see that when they see her as like the fruit, they see, oh, it's beautiful, let's take her. Abraham is the snake. He's the snake in that scenario because he's the one lying and deceiving. And so we see like different people, like I mentioned before, Jacob. He's always trying to get the right thing, but he's doing it through deceit and trickery. And it always happens to him too, doesn't it? He reaps that a lot. And so do we do the seed of the woman, the righteous thing, or do we the seed of the snake, be deceitful and snaky and sneaky? And, I believe that Messiah is on this when he's calling people brood of vipers or sons of snakes. That is literally what he is calling back to. So The idea of a son of, I know we have our own vernacular as far as that goes in our culture, but son of, biblically speaking in this time, meant you did something like that person. So like a son of Abraham is a son of faith. Jews call Gentile converts to the faith a ben Avraham, a son of Abraham, because it's by their faith, not their lineage, that they're converted. You have the son of God, does something that God does. Yeshua is constantly saying this. He's like, I do and say what he says and does. And our particular one that we use in our culture is not so much meaningful like that, but yeah. Okay, so 5 is attempt to determine the directionality of the analogy. This one gets pretty confusing, and I touched a little bit on it last time, but let me read just a sample. He says, no doubt some biblical scholars will take exception with the following guidelines on directionality. Now, directionality was depending on the chronology of Scripture. Some books of the Bible, what do you call this? Where there are different views on how early or late different books of the Bible are based on the language used, the things that are mentioned in the Bible. Like the book of Job, some people believe it's very early, some people believe it's newer, and there's a word for that whole study, I forget what it is, but that's kind of what this is, where it's saying that technically the Torah gives us the earliest, oldest history, but also that history was given through Moses, so he wasn't there. He's writing, and that also has a word that I'm forgetting too, retrospective. He's looking back at something that he wasn't there for. And so God gave him that information through the inspiration of himself. And so that's what directionality has to do with. It can be very tricky and complicated, but it has to do with a narrative analogy, meaning who inspired who. And as an example, he says, no doubt some biblical scholars will take exception with the following guidelines on directionality, but as a rule, this is how I work. And this is a simpler approach. He says, if a narrative analogy is found in a single book, the OT or NT, Old or New Testament, one can assume the canonical author knows the end from the beginning as well as the beginning from the end. In this sense, we can interpret a narrative analogy within a single book as bi-directional. Second, I work under the synchronic premise. By the way, Postell loves the word synchronic premise that the stories and prophecies in the canonical version of the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, the later prophets, Isaiah, Malachi, and the writings, Psalms through Chronicles, allude to the stories in the canonical Torah, especially in Genesis. Meaning those books kind of quote or go back to an analogy from Genesis as meaning it's the first or the oldest book. It was first before these other things. He says, I realize my understanding of the directionality will not be acceptable to all biblical scholars, but in the absence of consensus, I find considerable joy in the simplicity of believing, and yes, I use that word, in the priority of the stories of the Torah. So he takes it that the Torah is first, just like it's first in our Bible, that anything else would be alluding to that, not vice versa. Not that Lamentations was actually before Genesis or something like that. Mostly that, and this can, in a very complicated way, affect how we do a narrative analogy, but for the most part, it can become just very confusing and probably something you may not have even ever thought about until I brought this up. Thanks, Seth. Okay, 6 is to determine the emphasis and exegetical function of the comparison. And this is a short section on this. Determine the emphasis and exegetical function of the comparison. It says, we must determine the emphasis and exegetical function of the comparison that is the most consistent with the repeated themes, literary patterns, and other narrative analogies in the book. Is the point of comparison on what is similar or on what is different? And if similar, we are dealing with a narrative analogy that expresses equality, similarity, or a greater than relationship. And if the point of comparison is on what is different, we are dealing with a comparison that focuses on a less than or a complete opposite. So basically figuring out, is it synonymous or is it antithetical? Is it similar or opposite, and in what way? And like I said, we do find meaning in opposites in the Bible. Like I just gave a handful of examples. It highlights both of, different people's lives in different ways. Okay, 7, and there's 8 of them here. It says, posit an interpretation that makes best sense in the context. Okay. It says, when we appeal to the broader context, we may also discover a broader intelligible pattern in a cluster of narrative analogies. In my study of narrative analogies in Genesis, for example, I discerned a strategic arrangement of individual stories, creating a macrostructural narrative analogy, we'll get into that more on later, between Noah and Genesis 1 through 3, and between Abram in Genesis 11 through 15 and Moses. Such is also the case with respect to narrative analogies in Matthew and Acts. What makes me want to look those up? I'll say this, Genesis is certainly guilty of probably being the most analogous book in the Bible. Just so many things that are set up and meant for us to see how it repeats. And like I said, it's usually never the same. It usually is an opposite thing later, or certain elements only. Even like I said, the fire and the water and such. Does that bring anything to mind right away when I say between Noah in Genesis 1 through 3 and Abram in Genesis 11 through 15 and Moses? Boy, I'd have to think about that. And such is also the case in Matthew and in the book of Acts. Interesting. But yeah, he gives like an excerpt from an article. Apparently he wrote a book on reading Genesis. That would be interesting. Okay, our last one, number 8, maintain an open hand. Now, so he says narrative analogy is an implicit comparison. The authors rarely, if ever, tells us what they mean by them. Whenever we land on an interpretation of a narrative analogy, therefore we ought to posit it lightly and with an open hand. He says, I can think of many bona fide, fully in compliance with all the criteria narrative analogies whose meanings still elude me. I can also think of scholars whom I deeply respect who posit interpretations of narrative analogies with which I disagree. Finally, I can also think of occasions when I have changed my mind about the meaning of an analogy or have come to a more nuanced interpretation. Yeah, so sometimes we may come to a comparison that we change our mind about later, and I have found several times, or sometimes, I found another part in that. It's not just 2 things, it's 3, 4, and 5. But Daniel brought up the well as an analogy, as an example of wells and weddings, and then we get to John 5 or 4 about the Samaritan woman at the well. She's not married. And so that's how biblical poetry works, finding opposite as meaning as well. And he says, given the abuses of typology and our productivity to superimpose our own personal understanding of NT theology back onto our readings of the Hebrew Bible, humility is needed in the interpretation of narrative analogy. Interpreting narrative analogy is not like the consumption of fast food on the way to work. It is a participation in a Jewish wedding feast. Every dish has been carefully chosen for this special occasion and takes plenty of time to prepare. The servers bring out the dishes one at a time as the guests go back and forth and from table to table, dancing and schmoozing and eating some more. Postell comes from a Jewish background. And the feast isn't over until the wee hours of the night. The interpretation of narrative analogy involves lots of thought and lots of time. When trying to interpret narrative analogies, all of us must be prepared to ponder their meaning over the course of our entire lifetimes. For in the words of Tuman and Kelsley, reading biblical narrative requires attention to a host of details, patience to see how they develop and intertwine, and trust in the writer's purpose. It is a process that requires reading and rereading, usually for many years. Now that we have discussed the general issues involved with the interpretation, this is how he ends his chapter, of all narrative analogies. In the next chapter, we focus specifically on the interpretation of narrative analogies, whose exegetical function is to highlight similarities between the target story and its source. All right, I hope that was nerdy enough for you. Lots of terms that we're probably not usually using. So when we come to the idea of an interpretation, I brought up the idea of poetry simply because sometimes it's just simply poetic. There's not a meaning. The meaning is in the opposite or the similarity. Like, get it? Jesus and Jonah are similar. Adam and Noah are similar. They're like, one is like the other. And that is enough for the meaning. It doesn't always have a profound meaning other than that. And like I said, it is simple but profound in itself, that the story acts as poetry. Any comments or observation on interpreting narrative analogy? Did that sound misleading to you guys? I said, like, we're going to talk about narrative analogy, and it's like, oh, well, it might not mean what you think, and it's rather poetic, and it doesn't always mean something other than someone or something is similar or opposite to each other. And basically, in my assessment, the entire point is that it's the story is like poetry in the Bible. So I'd venture to say a lot of the Bible uses parallelism in some sort, whether it's in narrative analogy or chiastic structures, word plays, etc. The word, fraught with parallelism is kind of how I would see it. I don't know, 70, 80%, something like that. Daniel?
I think another good thing about seeing how this story is just a repetition of an earlier story, it reinforces in our minds that God really wants us to understand this. He's not just telling, because like when I taught English to foreign students, I would have to explain something, some grammar concept, and I would give examples. I would give, I said, okay, here's how you form make this sentence negative or put it in past tense. And I would write different sentences as examples,
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, the more examples they hear, the more it sinks in, the easier it is to understand. If you just give one example, okay, they might remember, but maybe not.
Right.
But it's like the more examples you can give, the easier it is for people to really learn
Get
the
it.
language. And we're learning God's language.
That's right, the language of the Bible.
Learning God's ways is like learning a foreign language, because we don't think like He thinks. My ways are not your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts. So He wants us to learn to think like He thinks, and to do that, He has to repeat the story over and over in a variety of different ways with different characters.
That's right.
And you mentioned Jacob, and how he he put the goat hair on his hands and neck to deceive his father,
Right.
who couldn't see. And then he gets deceived. He reaps what he sows. That's the lesson. You reap what you sow. One of the movies, a lot of Bible movies I don't care for because they add stuff that it's not in the Bible. But I remember years ago there was one Bible movie about Jacob, and they added this part, but it was really a neat part that they added. When he woke up from the wedding night and realized he was with Leah instead of Rachel, in the movie they had him say, the hair felt just like Rachel's hair. And I thought,
that's like what he was pointing out with
the
blindness and the blindness.
Yeah, Esau, the hair, Isaac thought the hair felt just like Esau's hair. So they have Jacob saying the hair felt just like Rachel's hair.
Yeah, they're connecting the story further. That's cool.
So
I like
was
that.
a good embellishment. It's not in the Bible, but it was a neat embellishment.
This last time, and I wish I would have wrote journal of it when we were watching the Ten Commandments, that with Charlton Heston, there were so many things that was like I mentioned, the one when Moses is in the pit with the mud with the other slaves, and the one man says, "Oh, God didn't answer my prayer." He's like, "What do you mean?" He says, "I pray that I would behold our Redeemer before I died." And then here's Moses holding him as he dies in his arms. And we're like, oh, like Simon holding baby Jesus, right? It's like, oh, we get it. One is like the other. And I love that in the Bible movies when they do that sort of thing. They make like analogous interpretations, which is kind of fun. Okay, I can't hold this back anymore. One of my favorite ones that just blew my mind was the way that Adam and Noah is similar. So we're showing that Noah is like, not the replacement of Adam, but he's the new Noah. After the flood, it's 2.0, creation 2.0. So when you look at the story of Noah when he comes back to land and he's drunk, we see that Adam in the garden, Noah has a vineyard. Like, similar, right? We see that they both, one loses, or he gains knowledge of the tree of good and evil. The other loses knowledge by becoming drunk. They both become naked. They both get covered. And when you keep doing that, going down the line, it's like, oh, Noah is like Adam. And the way that it's set up intentionally wants us to look at it that way. They're both, the fruit thing are both different. They're both naked for different reasons. They're both covered for different reasons. And you think of that, what that involves. Like, one is because of shame, or, not being shamed, while the other is because of sin. God clothes them. His sons clothe him, And so we see these different similarities, like I said, especially in the book of Genesis, all the way through. You can look at all the dreams, all the different times that someone is, or something is cast as the fruit. Someone sees it, that it's good, they take it, something bad happens, etc. There are just so many things that unfold in the book of Genesis that is full of narrative analogy. And so, I don't have time to share all of them with you guys. Like I said, I literally just for the first 11 chapters of Genesis typed out 4 pages of examples of narrative analogies. And like you're saying, some of them unfold throughout the Bible. And like, for instance, perfect example, Genesis and Revelation, some of the things that happen in a bad way in the beginning of Genesis undoes and becomes good again at the end of Revelation, the last few chapters. The Tahom, the chaos waters that's in Genesis 1-2, the current earth state is in, is this idea of this water. I went through this whole class of doing this, how water's being, God, what's the word I want? Manipulating or controlling waters throughout the Bible is a thing. And you see it through other people as well. And, splitting of the sea and all the way to the even turning water into wine, all these different things. It's like this thing. And we see in the end of Revelation, it says, and there was no more sea. And it's like, whoa, okay. That's interesting. That's part of the no more evil, no more tears, sorrow, all these things. There was no more sea. So we get to the point where it's back in no more temple, now we don't need a temple for God's presence. We can actually be in his realm without dying, without it being dangerous to us. So those have a lot of meaning for us when we look at, especially when we look at how the end of Revelation unfolds. So any comments, questions, observations before we close with this session? Good? Okay. Well, let's go ahead and close there. And there's a few more chapters in the book that we will probably go over. If it's too intense, I may just kind of go over some things. I've chosen to not go over some things that I just felt is like, okay, that's just really confusing and gets kind of deep into stuff. So thank you for your time.